Okay, everybody, make sure you got your note sheet ready. This is our final World War I online lecture, and what we're looking at here is the aftermath of the war. The mastery question we have for you today is what political, economic, and social effects did World War I have on the United States? So we're going to take a look at 5 different issues that all took place after the war, which have a pretty major impact as to what the United States would be like post-World War I. The first one that we're going to take a look at is prohibition. So during World War I, the war itself bolstered the temperance movement, or the movement against alcohol, because many associated sobriety with patriotism, primarily due to the fact that many Germans owned breweries. There was also the necessity to conserve grain during wartime. So there was actually a pro-wartime Prohibition Act, which banned the sale of most alcoholic beverages. However, after the war, the 18th Amendment was passed in January of 1919, and within it, as we see Section 1 of the amendment, prevented the manufacture, sale, transportation, export, import of alcohol, which would last for over a decade. As many American soldiers were still out of the country when the vote took place, it's possible that they could have rallied enough support against the 18th Amendment to force Congress to vote it down. The next major issue is race riots. So in the summer of 1919, the actual summer itself came to be known as Red Summer because of the over 24 cities, including Washington, D.C., Omaha, among others that you see on this map, experienced violent, racially motivated uprisings that resulted in about 43 different lynchings, 16 people were shot, and 8 African-American men who were burned at the stake. The main reason that these race riots were taking place was that the manpower mobilization from World War I was cut off. The industrial cities of the North and the Midwest had some severe labor shortages now that the factories weren't producing war goods. This coupled along with over 500,000 African Americans who immigrated from the South to the industrial cities of the North. The worst was in Chicago, where a young black man was drowned. Race riots occurred for nearly 2 weeks. In the South, lynchings were occurring more frequently, and in the North, sometimes white people reacted violently to African Americans who arrived after this great migration of African Americans was underway. So the really big factor here was that as soldiers were coming back looking for jobs, there was a competition for jobs that some African Americans held, leading to these riots. We also have a severe case of inflation or rising prices that had been held in check during the war that took place as we got into the 1920s. So after the war, Americans rushed out to buy the consumer goods that they couldn't get before, and also in place of war bonds. During the war, the Food Administration raised prices on corn, wheat, cotton, cattle, other agricultural products. But after the war, these prices fell sharply, making it difficult for farmers to pay their mortgages or buy what they needed for the next growing season. So this pain inflation was also felt by industrial workers when their wages did not buy as much as it did during the war. So in 1919, more than 4 million workers went on strike at one point in time or another. Many Americans, as we stated right here, denounced strikes, characterizing them as a threat to the old social order and a possible prelude to a Bolshevik-style revolution that recently took place during World War I when Lenin came to power in Russia. The biggest strike was in February of 1919, which is known as the Seattle General Strike, which you see in the newspaper, which is on this page here. In the Seattle General Strike, over 100 different unions collaborated to participate in this hence general strike, which led to many Americans denouncing the strike, as we just talked about. The mayor of Seattle, whose name was Ole Hansen, summoned the police to arrest socialists and the staff of labor-owned press outlets. And the national press kind of deemed him a hero. They called him even the savior of Seattle. Even though the strike lasted just a few days, what it resulted in was a very anti-radical sentiment that went well into the 1920s. So the big thing that you're going to see happen is there's going to be a huge fear of people who are in unions and strikes because they start to associate it more with communism and socialism. Probably the most deadly is what we're taking a look at right here, which is the 1918 flu pandemic, better known as the Spanish flu. So the deadly Spanish flu started to break out just as the Great War was winding down. By the time it kind of subsided, it killed a fifth of the world's population, upwards of 40 million people, and killed more people than those who died in World War I combined. As you can see, the definition of a pandemic is the spread of an infectious disease that spread across a large region. So, for example, multiple continents. If you take a look at the map we have here, the numbers that you see represent some of the locations of where the initial waves of the flu broke out. 2s, 3s, then being later on, but the arrows showing the direction where they occurred. So you can start to see the path of where the flu started to spread. Like I said, the great influenza pandemic killed millions worldwide, and it spread like a predator feasting on prey. The areas of port areas, major cities, transportation centers saw the earliest cases of it due to the mass amount of people. But what it did in America is that it really shook our confidence in the medical establishment that had previously found vaccines for other lethal diseases like smallpox and typhoid. People tried to do everything from getting the virus. For example, we've seen this picture. We see guys gargling with a special mouthwash, to even in a baseball game, people wearing masks. But it was not until years after the pandemic that scientists made any special breakthrough. There's also the Red Scare. This is the first Red Scare. There's going to be another one that we'll talk about when we get to the 1950s, but how we define Red Scare is a widespread fear of radicals and communists. So as we just got talking about the emergence of the Soviet Union and as a communist nation, this really fed these fears. So communist ideology called for international workers' revolution before capitalism's to fall. So to this end, as we see here, that's the Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin encouraged and supported revolutions outside of his country. So in Central and Eastern Europe, there was a series of communist revolts that did break out, and in some places it made it seem as if the worldwide revolution was starting. So with this revolutionary activity abroad, and with some of the strikes that we just got done talking about, like the Seattle General Strike, it prompted the first American Red Scare, ultimately a fear of communists plotting revolution in the United States. So in order to counteract this, we could say that a lot of First Amendment rights were sometimes diminished as the country started to succumb to this anti-communist hysteria. We really thought that communists were infiltrating not only unions, but our government as well. So all these labor disturbances that we talked about, there was also some bombings that took place that were linked to anarchists. People wanted to overthrow the government, and it resulted in an aggressive targeting of suspected radicals. So as we see in this Chicago Daily Tribune, that there was 36 death bombs sent to different leaders. These letter bombs were mailed to many different individuals, usually prominent government officials, businessmen, law enforcement officials. And the guy who was launched the prevention from further attacks, his name was A. Mitchell Palmer. He was the United States Attorney General. So he launched a series of raids against radical and progressive organizations, many times without search warrants. Some members of these organizations that he infiltrated were from South or Eastern Europe, and many were not even charged for their crime or tried. In fact, many were just simply deported. So as we see in this image here, you have individuals awaiting deportation hearings at Ellis Island. So while their due process rights were not necessarily followed, it was a product of this Red Scare. And with all these things taking place, we have an election in 1920 where people really wanted to get back to the America of old. So the election of 1920 was the first presidential election in which women were allowed to vote under the 19th Amendment, presidential election, I should say. Many Americans overwhelmingly elected Warren G. Harding, who promised a return to simpler days in which he called a return to normalcy. So before we answer this question of, was it worth it, what I want you to take a look at is some of the highlights that we've talked about throughout this. 80% of the public supported the war. It was a huge economic investment in that it bolstered the United States economy. factories started to produce war goods. Think about the loans that we provided European countries and the money that we backed the Allies with and how we felt that was needed to protect our allies to get that back. We traded significantly more with the Allies. Some of the cultural connections, and that there were immigrants who were both German and Irish who wanted to see the Triple Alliance and later Central Powers be victorious over our allies in Britain and France. We tried to become more of a global presence, the policeman of the world. Woodrow Wilson's and his 14 points and eventually the Treaty of Versailles and League of Nations would have allowed us to be that way, or so he viewed it. Some of the civil liberties issues, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and how people were no longer able to challenge the government during times of crisis. And then the Red Scare and the Palmer raids, and how some people's rights were taken away in order for what we thought was greater protection. So the aftermath would have resulted in more war. World War II will be following along. The flu pandemic, killing over 40 million people. President Wilson, though he would not run for re-election and die soon after in the 1920s, felt that he had failed to mend relations. And ultimately, before we get to World War II, the rise of Adolf Hitler.